In this video, I want to explain why was Finland never conquered by the Soviet Union. And the reason for that is twofold. Um, Reason number one, they used their brilliant diplomatic skills in order to convince Stalin that Finland actually doesn't need to be conquered and treated like the other Eastern European countries that collaborated with Hitler. And reason number two, in the Winter War, Finland, a country that then used to have 4 million people, they managed to kill some around 400,000 Soviet soldiers while losing only 70,000 of their own. And by the way, the Soviet Union back in the day used to have somewhere around 200 million people. Not to mention that the situation for Finland was even harder. They weren't just at a disadvantage if we look at their population size, they also practically had zero tanks. The entire country had 32 tanks and some around 800 aircrafts, while the Soviet Union had some around 5,000 tanks and 5,000 aircrafts. And here you can see the cemetery where the Finnish veterans were buried. And even today in Finland, when they celebrate their Independence Day in 1917, they actually, in a way, celebrate their victory over the Soviets in the Winter War. So, and before I explain to you what brilliant tactics they used in order to win in the Winter War, I want to explain to you what other disadvantages existed in Finland and how did they manage to overcome those disadvantages. So during the October Revolution in Finland there was a civil war between white and red Finns, and the white Finns, the nationalists, ended up killing 8,000 red prisoners of war, and in many other countries that would create a certain percentage of the population that would be willing to fight for the Soviets when they attacked, but not in Finland. Why? Because they had a very strong sense of national unity. Jared Diamond argues that that sense of national unity actually saved them from being occupied by the Soviets, and that national unity was primarily a product of uniqueness of their language and their great achievements in sports. They won the Olympic gold medal in the 1924 Olympics. So in a bizarre way, their sport performances maybe saved them from the Soviets. But yeah, and not to mention that Finland had the longest border with the Soviet Union, which also wasn't good for their defense capabilities. But they had a few aces up their sleeve. First of all, they noticed that Stalin is constructing railroads that just on its surface appear to be going nowhere. They just stop in the woods near the Finnish border. So it became obvious to them that Stalin is preparing to attack them, and that's why they began to construct the Mannerheim line. And since Finland was still not quite an industrialized country, they used trees in order to stop the Soviet advance, but they had many other assets. And by the way, Stalin primarily wanted to conquer Finland in order to secure Leningrad, but the Finns were actually correct in assuming that had they not fought so ferociously, that Stalin would have conquered the entirety of their country. It is only because they managed to kill some around 400,000 Soviets, if we also count those that were imprisoned, they were killed later by Stalin. I'm talking about the Soviet prisoners of war. So yeah, it is because they fought so ferociously that Stalin actually in the end decided to only take 10% of their territory, which is quite a lot, but compared to getting completely occupied is kind of a triumphant defeat, one could say. And yeah, the Soviets, they had a very strong air force and a very strong tank force, but the Finns just invented a Molotov cocktail, and they called it a Molotov cocktail as a joke because Molotov claimed that the Soviets are actually giving humanitarian supplies to Finland. And so the Finns then said, well, if bombs are humanitarian supplies, then we have the Molotov cocktail. And something weird happened in this war. One country, when it seemed that Finland was about to lose because they lacked in artillery, they simply were unable to produce enough grenades. One country stepped up and gave them enough artillery to defeat the Russians. Try and guess what country. Mussolini's Italy, yes. And I'm not denying that Mussolini was a horrible dictator that committed war crimes in, for example, Ethiopia and Croatia, but he did save Finland, and Hitler at the time did not want to help the Finns because of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but Mussolini, as a fascist, kind of naturally hated Stalin, because Stalin was a communist. And even if 50% of their grenades, of Italian grenades, did not explode, they were still useful in the same way in which North Korean grenades today are useful to Putin, even if most of them don't explode. But yeah, and the Finns were also quite brilliant in using camouflage, and they had orders to kill the Soviet officers first in order to create chaos, and that tactic actually worked, and a similar tactic was also used by the Viet Cong. But after the end of the Winter War, how did the Finns manage to convince Stalin not to conquer them completely? Well, they actually agreed to a quite humiliating economic treaties. Instead of buying Western cars, they had to buy shitty Soviet cars, and they also needed to pay a very large sum of money as reparations to the Soviet Union. But in a bizarre twist of fate, the fact that they needed to pay those reparations, it forced them to quickly industrialize, and in the end it forced them to develop their country quite rapidly. And today Finland is one of the most developed European countries, and actually they have a very educated population because they insist on investing a lot in education in order to create technology, and they are one of the most prosperous countries in Europe actually. And so what can we learn from the example of Finland? Well, if you're a smaller power and you want to defend yourself against a much larger imperialist state, what you should do is essentially agree to a degree of humiliation and give them some territory, but you also at one point need to draw a line and say, if you want to take more, then we are going to fight until every single one of us is dead. And you also have to be effective at fighting, which, for example, many other countries such as Poland and Czechoslovakia were simply unable to do. But at the time, the Soviet generals still lacked the experience they needed, and yeah, like Czechoslovakia, for example, they simply lacked the willpower to fight, while the Finns had a strong sense of national unity and pride and did not lack the willpower, which is why they managed to kind of regain their freedom. No, not even regain, actually, to remain, to exist as a free country. Okay, if you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more videos like this.